Mark, let's start with the history of EdTech evolution. You break it down into three stages. So why these stages and why do you find it helpful to think about the evolution that way?
Right. Well, generally, I think it's useful to kind of think about the advance of technology generationally, right? You go over and talk to the aerospace folks, and they talk about fifth generation fighters. You talk to the telecom folks, and we're on the fifth generation of internet and wireless connectivity. In EdTech, we're still only just beginning Gen 3, and we like to think about it from that perspective because it helps the educators to really get a handle on the evolving role of technology in their classrooms. When EdTech first started, really the foundational idea was just to take content and information that the educators had always used in print form and to make it digital. And it was as simple as that. And the team at Amira actually helped to build one of the most successful of those first gen text to digital applications called Accelerated Reader. And those pieces of software were helpful because they created all the convenience and scalability and long-term memory that's inherent in the digital process, but they didn't add a ton to just having pieces of paper beyond convenience. Then what we saw is that people figured out that the digital process enabled a new form of content where we weren't bound by the linearity of the textbook or the printed page. And so the second generation of ed tech, and it's the ed tech that's in almost every classroom today, is personalized and adapted content where we can deliver what amounts to a tailored bespoke book to each student. And again, that's useful, it's helping, but it's still incredibly limited. And what we believe is that we're now ready for the third generation, which is defined by the technology actually replacing, substituting, uplifting the instructional process itself and having a direct role in the dialogue of learning that to this moment technology's not had. So 1, 2, 3, those generations help the educators to really put their fingers on why technology can do more now than we've been able to do before with AI.
And I imagine those generation evolved with the evolution of the technology itself. Were there any important breakthroughs in technology that kind of ushered each generation?
Absolutely. Well, listen, it's obvious, right? The first generation was just defined by the introduction of the internet and the ubiquity of online access. The second generation was really defined by our capacity to manage content in a more intelligent form and to introduce adaptive assessments that let us pinpoint student capabilities in an efficient way. But again, what you really saw with that Gen 2 technology was a mirror of what was happening in sort of the broader web world. And for sure, what we're seeing with Gen 3 is that the foundational shift is the emergence of speech recognition, machine learning, conversational AI, all the tools that are defining Web 3.
And Amira is certainly a Gen 3 technology. So what does it bring to the table? And what's the potential there?
Right. Well, I think the starting point for understanding Amira is that the software did not come into the world as a set of technologies looking for a problem to solve. It evolved really from the opposite point of view. Sometimes when I talk to incredibly smart, incredibly sophisticated people, like almost everyone listening to this podcast, we forget that reading is a struggle for most students, and in fact, for a very significant number of adults. And there is a huge literacy problem. Many of the policymakers call it a literacy crisis with very little exaggeration, where students are less and less able to read well and to translate that reading into logical, grounded comprehension. And so Amira emerged because of the test scores and the data that tells us that students are not doing well in the early stages of literacy acquisition. And what we tried to do was to imagine the technology that could really make a difference in helping students learn to read. And then we work backwards from that model of intelligent tutoring to figure out what AI components were necessary to allow us to deliver the solution that the research tells us is required to boost reading skills.
Okay, and how did you approach this thing? Maybe there was a journey that you went through, different stages,
Yeah,
different potential solutions, and what final solution you
yeah.
settled on.
Well, let's start with the final solution. So the final solution is that Amira mirrors the tutoring process that we see in the research does the best job of helping us to scaffold reading skills. And that process, I'm guessing most people learn to read precisely this way. That process is for the student, the young reader, to sit next to a good reader and to read out loud and to build their fluency through that act of oral reading. But when that young reader hits words or phrases that they don't understand or can't decode and pronounce properly, then the better reader, the tutor, gives them a hand to help them build the gap skills. And so it's a one-to-one tutoring model based on a Socratic dialogue that enables the learning reader to acquire reading mastery through practice. And that is exactly what Amira does. Amira basically opens up a passage, a story, a book on the screen. We take away all the pictures, all the cues. We ask the student to read that passage out loud to Amira. There's no teachers, there's no parents. The student reads out loud, and Amira seizes on the moments where that student is struggling to help that reader get better. And that interaction between the student and the software we call a micro intervention, because Amira employs all kinds of fancy techniques to help the student to learn how to do things like decode words and to be more aware of phonics and to ask questions that lead to better comprehension. So how do we get there? Well, we got there pretty much the way that I think most good AI technologies evolve. We got there through a very lengthy journey of experimentation and A/B testing. And you guys can tell that I've been building software for a long time, but it may surprise you to know that Amira is the culmination of almost 30 years of research and development at the combination of Carnegie Mellon University and a very successful ed tech company called Renaissance. And it was the learnings from both teams that came together that allowed us to create Amira.
You have several papers on that, and uh, in terms of the system in action, um, I encourage everyone to check out the videos on the Amira website. Uh, they're really impressive, and they give you a very clear idea of how the system helps kids to improve their reading skills. And in terms of the uh, research that you've based the system on, and can you talk more about it, and also about the results of comparing Amira's uh, process with the traditional tutoring process?
Yes. So one of the things that we're big believers in is that ed tech needs to be thought about more in the context of pharma than in the context of conventional software. I think none of us would want to go to a doctor and have the doctor prescribe a drug that hadn't been through clinical trials and hadn't been carefully tested in random controlled trials under very rigorous circumstances to understand both the drug's efficacy in treating the intended disease and also in ascertaining side effects that may happen. When you think about it, ed tech is really drugs for students' minds. I mean, we are literally trying to rewire a student's brain to create things like early literacy, fluency, and early numeracy. That rewiring process is profound. But notwithstanding its vital importance in our lives, we have treated ed tech very casually compared to how we treat pharma. And so a big part of the Amira orientation is that we test everything we do, not just in the traditional AI way of comparing model outcomes against theoretical test sets. We tested in random control trials with carefully curated groups of students, and those tests are conducted independently by research universities like Columbia and the University of British Columbia. And so the starting point is that our models are driven not just by the conventional machine learning development process, but also by these field trials that tell us whether something's working with real life students. The other thing that I would just say on this topic is that it's important to think of Amira as a stack of AI. So Amira starts with the capacity to understand a student's speech. That's obvious. If you listen to the videos, you'll see, of course, there's speech recognition in there driven by deep learning models. But underneath that, there's a set of both kind of classic ML and more advanced reinforcement learning that's helping Amira to emulate the decision-making process that teachers and tutors go through. And so each of those component models has had to be developed, tested, and iterated over time to see that it's doing its particular piece of the puzzle well.
And to summarize the results of the research about the outcomes of Amira, we can say that the outcomes are not just equal to the outcomes of a human of best reading tutoring programs in roughly the same amount of time. And that's per published research by proventutor.org. That's what I found in your paper,
Yeah.
in your documents.
Yes, that is absolutely right. What we've seen is that compared to not using Amira, students grow their reading skills about twice as fast. And compared to giving a student their own really top-notch human tutor, Amira is 10 to 20% better. So, yeah, it's one of the rare situations, maybe like chess, where the machine is able to do better than the people at this point.
What do you attribute that 10 to 20% edge to?
Yeah. Well, you're going to laugh at this, but part of it is just Amira's infinitely patient and infinitely persistent. It takes a ton of time and effort to help a student become fluent. And the work that we need to do with each student is, frankly, incredibly boring and incredibly repetitive from a human point of view. So the mere fact that the software is able to hang in there day in and day out, and keep working with the student, it's hard for people to emulate that level of patience and persistence. But the other thing that we found that Amira brings to the table is in a capacity to continuously adjust to the learning needs of that student right now. You guys have probably seen this with your children or your nieces and nephews, but when kids are 5 or 6 years old, they're changing unbelievably quickly. And uh, uh, we as humans often are slow to make those adjustments in terms of how we're helping that child to learn. Amira, through many, many years of working with more than 1 million students, has gotten very adept at being able to measure incremental improvement in a student's skills and to help them to learn the next thing up. So that ability to be right on point is something the research tells us makes Amira super effective as a tutor.
This is definitely it's interesting. It's really interesting that one of the most important things is the one thing that we humans definitely could have more of, and it is patience. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I can say that I'm not a very patient person, so I empathize with all of the parents and teachers who, struggle to put in the 15, 20, 30 minutes a day that it takes to really work with a student individually. But you're right. One of the things that the research tells us is that setting a mirror aside, if we want the kids we care about to become better readers, one of the very best things we can do is to find the time and patience to just work with them, a few minutes every single day, and that does wonders.
It does wonders, and you
Yeah.
managed to bring it to 1 million kids, which is an unprecedented scale in EdTech, I think. So, how did you achieve it, and what is overall your uh, adoption
Yeah.
strategy?
Yes, well, it is unprecedented scale for ed driven by AI. There's some ed tech that's been widely adopted and has done really well in terms of getting into classrooms. But as mentioned, that ed tech is older stuff that has far less ambition to really move the needle on student learning acceleration. So I will tell you that we kind of learned 3 lessons about how to get AI into classrooms. One is to minimize AI, frankly. The educators don't want to hear about cool technology. They want to hear about outcomes and results. They want to actually believe that anything that they're going to spend money and time and energy on actually works. So, one of our learnings is to talk about Amira's intelligent, Amira's smart, but we don't make a huge deal about the AI because we often find that obscures the important message, which is that Amira works. Second thing that we've learned is that AI is fantastic. It's why Amira can help kids, but we had to learn that the AI has to be surrounded by a lot of sophistication in just making the technology live in real world classrooms. So one of my mentors uses the phrase enterprise readiness, right? It's not just can the software do its job, but can it do its job in the real world of the enterprise it's working in? In our case, as you might imagine, Amira works in classrooms with a couple of dozen screaming 6-year-olds, with alarm bells ringing in the background, with loudspeakers blaring that it's time for lunch. And so just being able to get to the place where we had AI not just for the big main things that Amira is about, but AI that protects the software from all the real world problems and issues turned out to be a huge driver of success. And then the last thing that we learned was to just constantly be iterating in the face of student feedback. The hardest thing for us is engagement. And so we had to really create tight feedback loops where we listened to the 6-year-olds when they told us what wasn't working for them. And may or may not be a surprise to folks that it turned out that everything from Amira's voice to Amira's clothes to Amira's way of praising them all came in for a lot of harsh criticism from the kids, and we had to do a lot of iteration before that stuff really worked.
How do you work with schools at this stage? Uh,
Yeah.
and in general, there are few things that kind of hinder adoption of AI technologies in educations, like COPPA, like uh, access to training data. But even starting with the more simple thing of getting in front of the right people at schools and getting them to commit to give it a try.
Yeah, listen, often say this. I've worked in other spaces where I had to work with very senior people, CEOs and senators. It is easier to get into a Fortune 500 CEO's office than it is to get into the office of most principals. They are drowning in crisis and things to do, especially the last couple of years with COVID. So number one, you have to really respect the fact that the educators are under a lot of pressure. And when you're dealing with them, you have to be super sensitive to being both time efficient and to giving back to them more than you're asking from them. So just really having empathy for the incredibly tough job that they do and the continual set of crises that they live with. Second thing, and this comes with things like COPA, is to really understand the vertical. I think the thing that makes the Amira team special, we've got a lot of great folks. I know everybody out there works on great teams, but our folks aren't just data scientists and engineers. They're data scientists and engineers who really understand education and early literacy in particular. So making yourself a domain expert and being able to speak not just the language, not just emulate the vocabulary, but really understand the world that we live in, which is a reading science world. I think this makes all the difference. People who are domain experts can tell very quickly if they're talking to a domain expert or a faker. And so getting to the place where you're real and authentic around that domain expertise has turned out to be crucial. And then the third thing I would say is find easy on-ramps. We do a lot of piloting with Amira where we just say, look, try it out. We know you won't believe it until you see it working with your kids, and making it easy for them to put all their risks and fears aside and just give it a try. This turns out to be a big relief for folks who are not technophiles and who have a lot of fears based on their past history that the technology is going to let them down.
How important was that research on the impact of Amira in getting the schools on board?
It's so critical. I can't even describe how foundational it is. Look, the educators, as you would hope, they're tired of doing things and buying things that don't make a difference. And so, one of the big mantras, just generally, not just about technology, but generally with the educators, is they want to start to do things from an evidence point of view. And it's not just, you know, AI tech, it's like the textbooks they're using, how many minutes they're devoting to different topics, the training they're giving to teachers. They want all of their decisions to be driven by evidence and research. The federal government actually passed rules about saying that the schools need to be more evidence focused. So it's made an enormous difference. It is the critical factor in our success, and we hope that Amira is helping to usher in a new generation of tech and tools that are grounded in hardcore research.
It's clear why they have this desire to be much more evidence based, based on those results that you published, where it looks like besides having so many things ed tech introduced into education over time, the impact is not shown that prominently in the results. So that's that's one of the reasons, I guess.
Yes, listen, maybe you have seen and heard about the most recent testing results in the aftermath of COVID. And what they are showing is that the students are performing worse today than they did 20 years ago. And when you think about that, right, what other part of our life or our society is worse than it was 20 years ago, right? Our computers are incredibly better. Our cars are better. If we go to the hospital, the healthcare we receive is better. So it says a lot that in 20 years, and that's the time frame in which ed tech has come into classrooms, we've actually gone backwards on the test scores. And it's easy to blame it all on COVID, and for sure, COVID's had an impact. But if you look even before COVID, the trend line was flat, it wasn't going up. And so, yes, the educators are super sensitive to the fact that since ed tech has been around, we can't point to a lot of gains in the overall test scores or overall results that we're seeing in the classroom.
What's your take on the scores deterioration? Is it really just flat, so EdTech had no impact, and then COVID had a negative impact, or there is more to that?
There's more to the story. I sometimes have the pleasure, the honor of working with the gaming people because they're so sophisticated around the things that they do in terms of creating engagement. But I often tell them that Amira's mission in life is to counterbalance what they've done to the kids, right? Because their stuff is so great, it's so fantastic, it's so entertaining that it makes reading kind of boring by comparison. And all of the data shows that with every passing year, the typical 5 or 6 year old is reading less. And that's not an accident. That's happening because the games are better, the movies are better, Netflix is on, right? For the 5 year old mind, there are many, many things now that create engagement, create attractions that I didn't grow up with, and probably most of you didn't grow up with to the same degree. So, no, it's absolutely the case that the challenge for the schools today is greater than it's ever been.
This is very concerning, of course, and it raises a lot of questions on different levels. Like we probably
Yep.
became worse at math or at multiplication, at least, because of calculators, and we're getting worse at reading because we can watch YouTube and get that same information. with the sound.
Yeah,
And
yes.
the some of the people would ask probably whether those skills are essential to a human being, or they can point to some skills that existed uh, many generations ago. Like most humans were able to garden several generations ago, and now they can't because technology kind of removed that need to do that. And is it the skill like gardening, or is it the skill that is so essential that we cannot lose it?
You won't be surprised by my vote. I believe the research, especially the neuroscience, tells us quite unequivocally that reading is a very special skill around uh, humans and human interaction. It is not an accident that reading began exactly when civilization began. It's people have been talking for a long time. Talking kind of has evolutionary support. It's sort of a defining characteristic of Homo sapiens. Reading emerged about 5,000 years ago. We don't have an evolutionary foundation for it in the brain, but it emerged because in a complex society, we need tools for absorbing information very quickly and logically organizing it. And it turns out when the neuroscientists put us under an MRI and they look at people who are good at reading, we have built up the brain structures that are just foundational to being able to absorb and logically deal with complex information and decision making. So I do not believe this is a kind of transitory skill around the economics of making a living. I see it as the core skill that people need to function in a complex, technologically driven society. And I think some of the best thinkers see that in the coming world of AI, one of the very few things we can teach kids to do that's going to survive all the change we're about to experience is to make them into good readers.
Reading is a very powerful skill, and it changes your brain uh, dramatically. So people who, without reading, we will definitely not have the same brains that we have today. This is a
And the MRIs tell us that. Yes, if you're interested, you can go out and just go onto YouTube and look at some of the MRI images that show kids who are highly fluent readers and the wiring inside their brain compared to dyslexic kids or kids who are not fluent. And what you see is just a profound difference in terms of the capacity to absorb information in efficient ways.
right. And regardless of the future, we need our kids to be able to read today, and we need them to be able to read well to succeed in this world. So let's talk about the AI systems powering Amira capabilities. You mentioned a few of them. I wonder what were the most significant challenges that you faced, your team faced, building the AI systems powering Amira.
Yeah. So the number one challenge we had to face is that we needed to do something that is pretty commonplace in the deep learning world around speech recognition, but we needed to do it from a class of readers, a class of users, sorry, that are completely different than where the traditional deep learning models have lived, right? So I worked for a long time in the adult speech space at a company called Nuance, and we pioneered machine learning models around automatic speech recognition. But today, of course, we all live with Alexa and Siri and the Google Assistant, and those deep learning models have become uh, close to human like in their capacity to understand adult speech. but it turns out that a 5-year-old is a very different kind of speaker than even a 12 or 20-year-old. They're different acoustically because of the physiological development of the vocal cords, but they're also different in terms of how they access and use language. And that's especially true when they're reading. Reading is not natural language, as mentioned. And if you've listened to an early reader, you know that they're constantly doing what we call word attacks, where they're trying to sound out the words. And that stream of phonemes that they utter when they're word attacks has no resemblance whatsoever to normal speech. So our most foundational initial challenge before we could do anything else with Amira was to tackle the problem of being able to understand a 5 or 6-year-old when they're trying to read. And that created challenges around, as you would guess, the acquisition of training data. We couldn't use the adult data beyond sort of the most foundational transfer learning. We did a little bit of goodness there, but it was extremely baseline in terms of the uplift we got. We had a lot of challenges around the variation in dialect and accent that you see with kids across the country in a very diverse world that we live in. So that was number one. The biggest issue was getting Amira to the place where she can just understand a lot of different kids who don't read very well. The second challenge that we confronted was the challenge of having Amira make instructional decisions in a world in which there's frankly very little data about what a good instructional decision is. We all know, right? If we can build a supervised learning model based on expert judgment, we've got a relatively easy path to goodness, right? If we're trying to detect malignant tumors compared to benign tumors, and we can stand up the oncologists and they can tell us with a pretty high degree of certainty that's a benign one and that's a malignant one, then we can do our supervised learning. We can make some progress pretty quickly. It turns out, probably you'll get this right away, it turns out that there is not the same degree of inter-rater reliability around the right move to make when you're trying to help a 5-year-old read a word. And there isn't a lot of research, there isn't a lot of science, there isn't a lot of deterministic kind of understanding. And so it's a much, much, much harder place to use standard kind of ML approaches. And then the third thing we've already touched on, the third challenge for us is the AI has to not only be good at producing outcomes, it has to be pretty good at not frustrating the kids. And it turns out, as you would guess, that these things are in violent tension, that what we want to do to make them better readers often frustrates the heck out of them. Right. So we have to find a balance between motivation and mastery, and that emotional component. And this is where we're still working today. Factoring that emotional component into the models and the decisions that they make is tough.
How do you experiment with the types of interventions and this emotional component? Do you have
Yeah,
some sort of a lab, or do you observe kids in action?
we do. So I think in this respect, hopefully, we are just emulating good practices around software development. We believe that we get feedback in a pretty structured way. We start when we are trying to bring something new into Amira. We start by getting feedback from the experts, right? We talk to the reading scientists, we talk to the master teachers, we make sure we're absorbing their experience and their knowledge. Second thing we do is do focus groups with the kids. So we take small samples, but where we can observe them working pretty deeply with the software and really get a good impression of how the proposed change is going to work. Third thing that we do is to run structured A/B tests where we can put that software into a production-like environment, production-like experience, and statistically measure goodness, but without exposing the mass of our kids to that new thing. And then the last thing we do is put it into production, but kind of on probation, where we put it out there and then we look at all our metrics and measure whether we've done damage or not. So hopefully that four-step process is just good software development lifecycle practice, but it's obviously super important to do that because we don't want to use 5-year-olds as guinea pigs, right? We want to make sure that we're minimizing any fallout from the mistakes that we make.
And in terms of the training data, I imagine there is some sensitivity around it. So how do you approach working with it?
Yeah, EdTech is, in this sense, 100% equivalent to healthcare and medicine. Healthcare and medicine, obviously, we operate under the HIPAA standards. In education, working with the young children, we operate under, as you mentioned, COPA and other privacy and data management rules. We have to be incredibly sensitive to this. You may have just read about the Los Angeles school district experienced a very bad ransomware attack where the attackers stole the data from EdTech software and put it out into the world. And that kind of breach, that kind of massive interruption of our responsibility to the parents and to the kids to protect them from having their privacy exposed is just front and center, not just for AI companies like Amira, but anybody who's collecting student information. So yeah, we have to be super, super careful. And a lot of our architecture is designed to create isolation and segregation so that hopefully the things that we need to do to create training and test sets and to improve Amira don't result in violations of the trust of our users and of kids who deserve better.
Let's talk about the origins of the company. I wonder how it started. What became the trigger for you to start Amira?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that Amira was born out of the lessons that the team here learned at Renaissance. And Renaissance was a pretty conventional software company. We built software for K-12, but it wasn't AI. It was, as mentioned, pretty simple, pretty straightforward stuff. But a number of us had long experiences and careers in worlds like speech and NLP and machine learning. And it was obvious to us that we could do better if we could put more advanced technologies to work. But if you know EdTech, you also know that it's not a place where it's been easy to finance radical innovation. It's much tougher to find the capital to do deep research and deep innovation than, say, compared to fintech or places where A, there's a lot more money, and B, the buyers and funders are much more technologically sophisticated. So when we saw that the technologies, especially in speech, had reached a place where there was a high likelihood of being able to leverage the advances in the world we lived in, we knew we needed to find some way to short circuit the innovation cycle. And our approach to doing that was to tap into academia in a big way. And I mentioned that ultimately Amira was born from a partnership with Carnegie Mellon, but just in general, we have relied very heavily on forging deep partnerships with academic researchers in the AI world. And so that ability to transfer years, in some cases decades, of academic research into commercial products and to work with the universities from a tech transfer perspective has proven to be critical in kind of squaring the circle of a world that badly needs AI but has not had the mechanisms to fund AI research and AI development.
And the founding team, how did you go about building it?
Yeah, so this is kind of the advantage. You see all the gray hair and the receding hairline. One of the advantages of working in the tech space for many years is that you work with a lot of great people. And so, as we thought about Amira, I was able to tap into a pretty deep Rolodex of folks that I'd worked with over time. Some of those folks I was literally working with at that moment in time at Renaissance. My co-founder and CTO was my VP of engineering at Renaissance, but we were also able to reach back into history, into places that were more AI focused, like Nuance, like a company that I worked at, started called Nova, that worked a lot in the NLP space. So we were able to find folks who'd worked together, trusted one another, and kind of bring them in. But as mentioned, the one thing that we've really worked on in terms of team building is finding folks who have a great education and reading background. And so that's where we've used the partnerships through the universities to acquire talent that really understood the domain.
And then you mentioned that funding is sometimes challenging for a breakthrough at tech companies. And there are multiple reasons. I think one of the most important is that it takes a lot of time to build a really impactful company in education, especially if you go after a very deep tech type of company. And it's not necessarily always match the profile of venture capital investors. So, what was your experience? You realized that from the beginning that you're going into that tough environment. What was your experience there? How did you manage to uh, fund the company?
Yes. So I think there are a class of venture capital folks who understand deep tech, hard tech better, and are more comfortable with it. But what we found was that we had to get through some of the foundational risk factors before even they were willing and able to provide funding. I mentioned one way that we short circuited the funding process was to essentially go into partnership with Carnegie Mellon and the University of Texas Health System. And you can almost see those as kind of seed rounds for us because they basically funded the early development of the core product. And the second thing that we did is that Pete and I did a little bit of self-funding to get to the place where we had a working demo. And so we worked for almost half a year, from a self-funded perspective to show and demonstrate the basic capability and to help people's imagination around what Amira would look like and work like. Third thing we did is we tapped into some VC relationships from earlier lives. So this is part of the advantage of being a serial entrepreneur and founding companies. I was able to use some of the credibility and relationships from those days to get a bit of an extension of the seed round, where even though people knew they were taking a pretty big bet, they were willing to do it just based on past history. And when we finally had something that worked, at its core, it didn't work like ready to go out there and kick ass in the classroom, but it worked enough that people could see that the really basic issues had been transcended and surmounted. Then we were able to do a Series A with some great VCs who have the patience and the vision to back something that isn't going to necessarily be ready for prime time in 6 months.
What were those validation points? You mentioned that it was not ready to perform at 100%, but what were the essential, like, until you achieve this, it's too early, but when you have this, it's like changes thing. And why
Yeah,
specifically those?
yeah, there were two validation points for it. It's a great question. There were two validation points for us. One was that without pretending to be able to support every student, we had to be able to demonstrate that a typical student could read to Amira and that the software would understand them, that we had enough of a handle on that speech rec problem that I talked about, that the investors could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The second thing, and I think this is just a classic, is that we found about 8 school districts that were willing to use Amira at a very early stage and to attest to its potential value. And in that testimony, in that vouching, they weren't saying, look, this thing is the greatest ever. This thing, is something we're ready to bank on. But what they did say that was key to the VCs is, number one, it's different than anything that we have, and frankly, different than anything we kind of imagined that technology could do for us. So the districts were really ready to stand up and say, we see the vision and we share the vision, right? We know there's still a journey before it's completely bulletproof and ready, but we were able to get a set of beta customers that vouched for the power and value of the idea. And it was those two things that I think really were our core ways to get past the natural skepticism of the VCs.
Natural cautiousness. I think
Yes, natural caution.
n-
Hey,
nature of the work requires that type of trait. And in terms of the market size and market opportunity there, how did you uh, talk about that?
well, that's the good news. So we've talked about some of the challenges, but listen, the great news about working in education is that the market opportunity is massive. People don't realize that education is the second largest vertical after healthcare. But there's more money spent on a global basis on education than anything except healthcare. And when you think about it, it's kind of natural, right? But, if you talk about a Maslow hierarchy, first thing is we got to be well. But second thing is hopefully we got to be educated. We got to take care of our minds. So people are rightly, governments are rightly, households are rightly spending a lot of money on education. And the best thing of all, from an investor point of view, is that almost all the money they spend today is on human capital. So if you look at within a vertical, what is the percentage of spend on tech? It is by far the lowest in education compared to anything else. So we were able to tell a very, very convincing story around a TAM for Amira that's roughly $55 billion because that is the current spend on human tutoring around the world to help kids be able to read just in English. So $55 billion in English spend, in total spend on tutoring to learn English. And obviously Amira's opportunity is to disrupt that spend with a 10x cheaper, 10x more scalable model. So we had a great story about the TAM and the market opportunity. All we had to do was persuade people we could really actually do the job.
EdTech is a massive segment of economy, and as you said, rightfully so. Uh, One can argue that it maybe should be bigger than healthcare because advances in healthcare are driven by educated uh, people. Speaking about the current team at Amira,
Yep.
how do you think about building it? What kind of people you're looking for? What kind of culture Amira needs
Yeah.
to succeed as a company?
Yeah, listen, I mentioned that I've been starting companies and working in technology a long time, and I'll tell you, I wonder sometimes if I know anything more about culture building than I did 30 years ago, right? I know a lot more about AI and how to create machine learning models, but culture's tough. If there's one thing I'm pretty sure I've learned that's right, it's that you got to be hyper intentional about culture. It is not going to be good if it's accidental. And so we focus a lot at the leadership level at Amira around the culture we want and what we can intentionally do to try to create it. And that starts with a pretty clear vision of the people that we want and need at the company. And there's a few things that I'll say. One is we want people who genuinely, not lip service, genuinely believe in the mission. Um, we are truthfully a mission driven company. We believe deep in our bones that if we help kids to become better readers, positive financial outcomes will happen. And what that means to us is that we don't have to put financial metrics first. We can put educational outcomes first and let the financial metrics follow. But it's sometimes hard, especially in certain parts of the company, sales, marketing, to find people who actually will orient themselves around that way of seeing the business, finance, right? So we look for people who really, really, really want to live the mission and care first and foremost about whether the software is actually going to do our users good. Second thing that characterizes our culture is that, yes, we're an AI company, but mostly we're a data company, right? We're a science company. We believe in experiments. And so we need and want people who are prepared to live their life in experimental fashion, right? Who take this mantra of being able and willing to fail seriously, and who are also willing to adjust their opinions and beliefs based on the data as it comes to us. We know that we don't know how to solve the problems we have, and so we know the only way we're ever going to solve those problems is to follow where the data and the evidence leads us. So we need people who are legitimately open-minded, flexible, oriented to evidence, and willing to live in that horrible experimental world where most of what we do on the short-term basis is a flop, right? And it's tough. And then the last thing I'll just say about culture, somebody said this really well to me. You know, a lot of folks talk about a culture where they don't want the a-holes, and that's, from our perspective, way too low a bar. We actually really want nice people at Amira, right? People that like to talk to other people, people who relish collaboration, people who get a charge out of positive interactions. So a big part of the culture for us is we're a remote team, and we have to fight all the problems that come when people aren't face to face by having a culture where people really, really, really do like to collaborate and talk and work together. So those are the three things we put the most emphasis on.
Which of three do you find the least abundant in candidates? Which is the biggest bottleneck?
Yeah. To be kind of transparent about a big surprise from my perspective, the thing that really comes hardest is finding people who are in that data oriented, flexible mode. Um, I mentioned sometimes it is a struggle in certain job categories to find people who are truly mission driven, but that's relatively easy to screen for, and there's a lot of mission driven people out there. But everybody talks about they want to be at a startup, but it's tough to find people who can actually live in the sweet spot. We see a lot of people who just don't have the resilience, right? They get worn down by the difficulty and the failure rate. It's just like the emotional resilience to cope with the constant setbacks and the roller coaster nature of the journey that we're on. Uh, it makes a lot of people not right for the company. But then on the flip side, there's a lot of people who are highly resilient, but they are resilient precisely because they're closed-minded, right? They're able to keep going exactly because they ignore the failures and they ignore the evidence and they just keep chugging along. And I think we all know people like that. We all see people in politics like that, where no amount of data, no amount of evidence is going to change their mind. But the beauty of it is they can keep going no matter what's happening around them because they've immunized themselves from the evidence of the failure and the downside. So yeah, it's tough to find people in that middle.
So, how to deal with that issue? You likely won't be able to change the part that is already set in their ways. So, your only hope is either find the middle or to coach the other part and help them through that roller coaster.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, listen, what I'll tell you, this is probably going to resonate, I think, with most of folks listening to this. It's really hard to coach closed-minded people out of being closed-minded. So, from my point of view, that's mostly being good at the hiring process. But you can help people to be more resilient, right? And you can create a culture where people actually do come to believe that they're not going to be fired because they run a failed experiment, or they're not going to, be criticized and ostracized because they do something that doesn't turn out well. So I think we've come to believe that you got to find people who are open-minded and evidence-driven, and that's a function of a good recruitment and interviewing process. But that once you get them in the door, you can through actively managing the culture, help people to ride that roller coaster better. And I'll just say, I think we all know this, right? This is where you can't help people with words. You got to help them with actions, right? You got to show that when things go wrong, that the senior leaders of the company take it with grace and take it with encouragement, and don't respond in ways that punish people because they're super sensitive to it.
Absolutely. And this is, as you said, it's not with words, it's with actions. And we're all humans, and it's so hard to
Yeah.
make sure you always behave as you as your best version of yourself would want you to.
Exactly. Yes, yes. Especially, I'm sure everyone out there who's is or has been a founder knows it's tough, right? Because you're working long hours, you're dealing with your own set of disappointments, you're managing many things at once, and yeah, waking up and not letting those things get to you in a way that transfers to your team. It's really hard. Believe me, I'm still learning this every single day. Yeah.
What's your approach? Some lesson to the people listening.
Yeah, a couple things I've learned. Probably this is hopefully common sense, but I see it violated all too often. If I'm in a negative frame of mind, I definitely take more than one beat before I hit the send button on email. I've found that one of the things that causes me to work against the culture we want the most is thoughtless email. Email's a terrible medium for communicating almost everything that isn't hyperfactual. It's often misinterpreted, even when you're actually sending good emails. So I've learned I write a lot of emails, I stick them in my draft drawer, and I let them percolate and fester for hours or even a day or two before I hit the send button, because I've learned that my best self will come around in that time frame, and if the email's ill considered, I can delete it or change it and end up with a better outcome. Second thing I've learned is that there are moments for feedback, and there are a lot of moments when it's not feedback time. And I try to really be intentional about that. If you don't find the moments for feedback, then you're not doing your job as a servant leader and as a mentor. But if you start to get into a mode where the feedback is not structured, it's not at the right time, it's coming with other folks around, then even if the feedback is good, the surround of that feedback is going to break way too much glass. So I've really tried to get better over time around dividing my interactions with folks into, this is a feedback moment, this is not a feedback moment. And a lot of the folks I work with know just from the title of my meeting invite whether this is going to be a feedback meeting or this is going to be an execution meeting. We're just in regular business. So.
Do not assume that everyone is able to accept your good feedback at any point in time. Yeah, because we're not.
Yeah, yeah, no, listen, but this is also the sign. I mentioned this open-mindedness. This is a sign of a person who ought to be at a data-driven startup. Is that they are open to feedback, right? Because this is the meaning of being in an experimental world. It's not just about the structured experiments we run around the product. Everything we do is an experiment, and we ought to be able to accept the fact that what we do sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, and we need to learn from not just the success but the failure. We have a model here. I don't know how many folks have seen it, but I'm a big believer in it. We talk about almost everything we do through the lens of the PDCA loop: plan, do, check, adjust, right? And the PDCA loop is not just about like software and the product dev cycle. It should be about everything. How we market, how we do feedback, and so I think if you can get people in a frame of mind where they think about things that way, then the check and adjust process, which is really the feedback process, it becomes a lot easier to take, right? Because then it doesn't feel so personal. It feels a lot more institutional. So,
Yeah, it feels more of a part of a standard process that you just go through.
No, one of the things I've learned is that sometimes if you can put an academic veneer around these things, that it helps people to cope emotionally with things that, to your point, are incredibly hard for them, right? And I've learned that these sort of jargon frameworks, these academic models, really can lower the temperature on things that otherwise are really super tough for folks.
I see. This is a great technique, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Let's turn to the future now. Uh, what do you see, or what are your goals for Amira long term? Where do you want
yeah,
to see it growing, and what kind of what kind of changes in education you would like to see?
yeah. So we have a pretty simple goal for Amira. When I grew up, the standard way you learned to read was the Dick and Jane readers, and then there was a generation where the standard way you kind of came into contact with reading was Sesame Street, right? And our goal for Amira is that for the next generation of kids, Amira is the standard way they learn to read. When they look back, as an adult and they say, what was the foundational tool that made me love to read? It was my time with Amira. So that's our goal. We want to create a cadre of kids around the world that think of us as their Dr. Seuss, their Sesame Street, their Dick and Jane reader, right? And when we've accomplished that, then we'll know that this company existed for a reason, and that the time and energy we're putting to it was well spent.
And in terms of the uh, future, how do we change the that flat line to declining line that we talked about
Yeah,
before in
yeah.
education?
Yeah, well, listen, I want to give an answer I deeply believe in, but may feel a little convenient in the context of this particular interaction. But I deeply believe that we can change the flat line if we evolve to a hybrid model of helping students that couples the best of people with the best of technology. And, you know, one of the most frustrating things is that often the dynamic in our world, and I think sometimes generally in AI, is to think about, people versus AI. Right? It's like who's better and when will AI be better than people? Our kind of belief, at least for education, is that learning is quite social, it's quite emotional, it depends on a human dynamic. People are essential, but we also believe that people have to be strongly supplemented and scaffolded with super smart tech. And so our goal is to really try to forge a partnership where the things that software does well couple with the things that people do well into a new model for that student, right? And it's a three-part harmony: a teacher, a human teacher, a student, and an intelligent tutor. And they're all working together to make the learning process happen.
This is a wonderful future. We already see early beginnings of it, and for sure we'll see more and more. And that's going to be very interesting to see which parts, as you said, the part of patience, for example, I now see clearly that will be the part that machine will take more of a lead on, and
Yeah.
what will be the other parts where a machine will lead, where the teacher will lead. Sounds good, Mark. Where can listeners learn more about Amira, and where can they follow you online? I know you're also hiring, so talk about that too.
Yeah, best place to learn about Amira is amiralearning.com. We try to make our site not just about the company and about the technology, but really about the mission we're on and about reading science and the research around reading. So take a look at amiralearning.com and follow some of the links to some of the other sites that we think are really important if you care about how to use tech in the reading space. In terms of following me, LinkedIn is probably the best place. We do a lot of posts and things as a company and as a team. And in terms of hiring, yes, we are very, very, very aggressively trying to expand the team. Amira's just exploding right now in terms of the adoption and usage of the technology. So we're especially looking for data scientists, particularly data scientists who have worked in the reinforcement learning area. We're also always looking for great quality assurance people who can help us to test this really complicated interaction that we deliver. And I mentioned engagement. We're looking hard for people who are creatives around building immersive experiences and can help us to couple Amira into the virtual reality, augmented reality that we think is going to be a big part of the learning process going forward. So if you've got those kinds of skills, give us a shout. We'd love to have you on board.
Sounds good. We'll add the relevant links to the show notes. Mark, thanks a lot for joining me today, and thank you for all the work you do to make our kids better readers.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's been fun. Hope it's been of use. So see everybody soon.